Hi, this is Lilian. We are back for another video about the Tower of God lore, and this time we're going to talk about the Empire of Jahad. So I wasn't sure how to approach it since there is so much to say, but I think that the ideal would be to make a video that chronologically retraces the history of the Empire, and that's why this first video on the Empire of Jahad will retrace the events of its creation until its current period of prosperity. I also warn you because some people have pointed it out to me, but obviously you have to be up to date to see this video if you don't want to be spoiled. And that's logical. If there were no spoilers, the video wouldn't even exist in the first place. So be up to date because it's going to be very spoilerish. First of all, there is the period before Jahad, a period that could also be called prehistory. We don't know much about the tower and its history before the arrival of Jahad and his 12 companions, but we do know that the administrators were there, that the workshop was already there as well, and that there were different civilizations on each floor that were, it seems, quite primitive. We also know that there was once an extremely powerful giant who divided himself into 5 beings, each of which could control an element of the tower, and they were called the Native Ones. In the hidden floor, the data of Kun Edan tells us that they were very powerful. They had direct descendants who shared the same powers as them, and the only one we know so far is Rak. There is also non-direct descendants who had similar power, but still much less powerful. And we have an example of these non-direct descendants with Hessa that we see in the Name Hunt Station arc. Then, you have to know that each floor was isolated from the others, because the only way to reach a higher floor was to pass the administrator's test, and only irregulars have the right to pass these tests. And then one day, Jahad and his 12 companions opened the doors of the tower. They entered and faced head-on the first floor, passed his test and reached the second floor. Thus began their ascension that they would later name the Great Journey. There are also many grey areas. We know that they passed the tests of the administrators. We also know that at a certain moment, the workshop created the Hell Express to train Jahad and his 12 companions. It is in this train that they met the god of the Guardians who taught them the technique of Shinwonryu, which the translation also calls the Black Hole Sphere of Shinsu, but which would be translated rather by Divine Source, and which is a technique which can be used only by irregulars, the only 2 exceptions to this day being the god of the Guardians and Akryong. Even if in the case of Akryong, we do not know if he is an irregular or not. Then we also know that Jahad and his 12 companions looked at the mirror of the past in the train and that they thus created a copy of themselves. Then we also know that Mirkea Luslek and another person named Quadrado, as well as direct descendants of the Native Ones, joined Jahad and his 12 companions during the Ascension, although we don't know at what moment of the Ascension they arrived. And there is also the fact that he had other companions that we don't know yet. Then, at a certain moment of the Ascension, some of the great warriors, that is to say the 12 initial companions of Jahad, will start to have children. We know for example that Ha-Yurin will have children with Arihan, twins, and that they will be considered the first generation of the Ha family. There will also be a second generation later on, notably with the birth of Ha Jinsung who we know met Jahad, and that they had a discussion. All these births will mark the beginning of a new age in the tower, that of the Ascension. After some time, the descendants of the great warriors as well as some of the inhabitants of the tower, thus people who today would be called non-regulars, began to ascend the tower. However, this wave of ascension raises many questions because it supposes that Jahad had already set up the system of regulars. For I recall that at the base, only the irregulars could climb the tower. The normal inhabitants of the tower could only climb if they accompanied the irregulars during the trials. But to create a system that changes the rules of the tower as much as Jahad will do with the regular system, it seems that you have to make a contract with all the administrators of the tower. We know that Jahad will make such a contract, but much later in the history of the tower. So did he make a contract with all the administrators? Was there a way to climb the tower for those who were not irregulars? These are all questions that have not been answered yet, so we'll have to wait a little while to find out more. Especially since a system like that of the regulars requires the creation of the internal tower and the intermediate tower, because at the base, the tower did not seem to have a separation into 3 parts, with the external, internal and intermediate tower, because ordinary inhabitants of the tower were able to join Jahad in his ascension. Then we also know that Arlen, Grace and V made their relationship official. Jahad at the same time announced his plan to become the king of the tower and to stop the ascension. Arlen, Grace and V did not agree with him and criticized him, but Jahad did not listen to them. He made a contract with all the administrators to become the king of the tower. This is what I was talking about earlier. This contract is very vague, we don't really know what it consists of. But anyway, after that, Jahad asked Arlene Grace to marry him, but she refused because she was in a relationship with V, then she ran away. Jahad had blocked the access to the 135th floor with a key, which he divided into two parts. The first part of the key was separated into 13, since it is found in the 13 weapons forged by Ashul Edwaru that are now called the 13-month series. These 13 weapons were originally meant to be shared between Jahad and his 12 companions, but they ended up in the hands of Jahad's princesses, which we will talk about in another video. The second part, on the other hand, is in the rings wearing by Wang Nan and Karaka. We don't know how many rings there are in total, although we can assume that there are 3 in all, the number 3 being a very symbolic number for Jahad, and it is to get this key that Arlen Grace and V will declare war on Jahad. This will usher in a new age, the Age of Genesis. The Age of Genesis can be divided into two parts. The first part is the Great War that pitted Arlen and V against Jahad in order to get the key to the 135th floor. They joined forces with other people who did not like Jahad, including some nations, the descendants of the native ones, and all the other people who did not like Jahad. It is known that there were many conflicts even among the other companions of Jahad, but in the end they all rallied to Jahad, so Arlen Grace and V logically ended up losing the war and became fugitives, except that during their escape, Arlen Grace became pregnant. Jahad, who was already enraged, tracked down the child when he learned of its existence. When he found the child, he killed it in front of Arlen Grace. After that, she went completely mad and tried to kill herself several times, except that she had already become immortal, just like the other 10 Jahad's companions and himself. But V, who had not made a contract for immortality, could not stand Arlen's madness and killed himself. After that, Arlen traveled around the tower like a ghost for a long time, hoping to find a way out of the tower, while carrying the corpse of her child, which she protected from rotting with a spell because she hoped to find a way to resurrect it once it was outside the tower. Jahad, on the other hand, put a curse on certain species that had rebelled against him. He exterminated all the descendants of the native ones and set up his empire, and began his reign, accompanied by the 10 great families. On his side, Merkia Luslek, who was a servant of V, created an organization called the Fug, whose purpose was to continue the opposition to Jahad. And this marked the beginning of the second part of the Genesis. This era was marked by a constant war between the Fug and the forces of Jahad. Several countries opposed to Jahad's takeover, including the 5 flower nations, allied themselves with the Fug by sending their best rankers for training. Among these rankers, some will form the group known as the Secret Garden. This was one of the most notable groups in the Fug at that time. It was led by Cha and Doan, who were accompanied by Kun Hind Luch, Taro York, Toro, and 2 other members who are not yet named. There are also other groups about which little is known at present, such as the group of Kel Helem. But this war was useless in the end. They were able to kill some important people, such as the 8th son of the head of the Lopobia family. But compared to the power of the 10 family heads, theirs was ridiculous. Jahad and the 10 great families finally got tired of the war and offered to their opponents 2 choices: coexistence or extermination. Most of Jahad's opponents chose coexistence, knowing full well that they had no chance. The empire asked to seal the most powerful warriors of the opposing countries, so the king of Doan asked her to stop the war and come back to be sealed, which she accepted to save them, because if she refused, her whole country would be exterminated. But before being sealed, she met the captain, a mysterious character resembling young Jahad, or also Wang Nan, and who warned her that a boy, Baam, would start a war when she would be freed. Then she will erase from the memory of the people of her country, except for her sister, all the memories of her, so that they do not have to suffer the guilt of her imprisonment, then made herself sealed. After that, Cha, who was in love with Doan, will go berserk and kill many of Jahad's allies. He will then ask to be sealed after meeting the captain, who tells him that he will be able to see Doan again when the boy appears. After that, Kel Helem gathered the remaining members of the Secret Garden and his group to try to assassinate Jahad. They were betrayed by Luke, who had negotiated their freedom with Liboric in exchange for information about their plan. But Liboric did not keep his word, and killed many members of the Secret Garden and kept the others as hostages. Kel Helem and his group were confronted by Jahad, who wiped out his entire group except for him, to humiliate him. Finally, the creation of the Wall of Peace and Coexistence marks the end of the Age of Genesis and the beginning of the Age of Coexistence. The Age of Coexistence is very long. It is known to have lasted for several tens of thousands of years, and it is quite difficult to establish a chronology because there are few dates and they are generally very vague. It is known that the remote elements of this period are often categorized in what they call the Middle Ages. The main events known from this period are the arrival of Enryu and the murder of the administrator of the 43rd floor, although it is not 100% certain that this happened at this exact time. There is also the creation of the Jahad princess system, the first generation of princesses, as well as the accident with Jahad, but we will talk about all this in a video dedicated to them. We know that Adori Jahad, the current commander-in-chief of Jahad's army, was born more than 5,000 years ago, that Hajinsung fought Kalavan 3,000 years ago, and that after that, Kalavan took the essence of the void for himself, became a high ranker, and put himself in the service of Jahad, after having made many companions. It is also known that how Queen and his 4 siblings, Anna, Vincent, David, and Albeda, somehow merged to form a being now called White, who would soon after become ranker, then slayer of the Fug. Finally, to go back to a more recent time, we know that about 1,000 years ago, Lopobia Elaine was sent to the name station after becoming regular. That 600 years ago, White was separated, and Joaquin and his 4 siblings were sealed in the train, which will trigger the whole story with Sachi, Daniel, aka Boro, and Roen, and that Hansung Yu and Hayuri were born 500 years ago. But the real major event of this period is the arrival of Phantominium in the tower, an irregular who will infiltrate Jahad's palace and slaughter all the high-ranking people in the palace. All except Yuri, according to the non-canon law, and who spoke with Jahad before disappearing completely. He will be followed by Urek Mazino, another irregular, who will enter the tower in pursuit, according to the non-canon law. Urek climbed the tower even faster than anyone else, in 50 years, went through the Hell Train, met the God of Guardians, went through the Hidden Floor. He also passed the Ariehon test on the 100th floor, and became the first person to pass this test, the second being Princess Arya Hagiferione Jahad. On the 77th floor, Urek met Baek Ryun, whom he returned to see after becoming a ranker, and with whom he created the Volhaiksong, one of the most powerful organizations in the tower. Then Baum arrived in the tower, and by his very existence broke the semblance of peace that reigned there. He is now between 11 and 12 years after his arrival in the tower, on the verge of triggering the advent of a new age, ending the age of coexistence. That's about it for this time. I know there are a lot of grey areas. There are some things I didn't say either, like for example the arrival of Hajinsung in the Fug. That's because we don't really know when it happened. The temporality is a bit blurred sometimes, but these are all normal things, as the development of the tower history is done at the same time as the plot. A lot of information comes from very recent chapters, and some information that I didn't say here is just mentioned, like the very recent discussion between Baum and Cha, where the names of the first men, the 5 flower kingdoms, the mechanical kingdom, and other things like that are just mentioned. That's why I don't think that this video will be relevant for long. Anyway, I let you. You can subscribe, like, comment, share, etc. and we will meet again for the next video on the 10 great families.